Greetings. What you're seeing here is a 20-year chart of the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil. Now, one of the most famous predictions I made, which was back in mid-2011, was when oil prices would fall and that they would fall. Because if you recall at the time, that was when everyone was outright hysterical about peak oil, and nobody knew which energy technology, if any, would save the day. It turned out to be hydraulic fracturing, and then later other technologies like electrical vehicles came into being at critical mass. But at that time, I predicted down to the level of an equation how quickly the candle could burn itself out in terms of oil staying high against all other economic forces. And many of the readers of my old blog, The Futurist, have said that of all my predictions, that was the one that impressed them the most. And that was a few years before my atom thesis, but very closely related to that. So now we're going to go to a video clip that I recorded a couple of years ago describing the article in which I made that prediction. That article is titled The End of Petrotyranny. So we go there. Today we're going to revisit a prediction I made on The Futurist almost 10 years ago, on July 1st, 2011 to be precise. And at that point, I had created a prediction about how oil prices would trend downward over the long term, not upwards. And if you recall, around 2011, that was the height of all this peak oil scaremongering, and when everyone thought oil will be so expensive that no one can afford cars anymore, and the airline industry would go under, and the entire economy would regress back to 19th century levels of prosperity, and other such associated nonsense. I had to rebut that to combat all that technological and economic ignorance, and I did so in an article that we will examine today. Now, many of the early articles on The Futurist, going all the way back to 2006, were specifically about this topic, how oil prices cannot stay high for very long because there's just too many alternatives that are hard at work to create another market solution. And that is true of any commodity that is given too much importance to the point that it becomes too expensive. And those early articles were way back in 2006 and are perhaps not as well written as something I might write today. However, this has culminated in a 2011 article that became very famous. It became one of my most famous accurate predictions, particularly given how large of an impact this had on the world economy and the time at which I predicted it. And that article is The End of Petrotyranny from, once again, July 1st, 2011. Now, I had written a number of articles before this point, kind of explaining to people how high oil prices just speeds up the rate of innovation of what is eventually going to replace high oil prices and substitute oil outright, or otherwise increase the supply of oil, keeping the price of oil low. And the same model applies to all commodities, but as you can see in the link, I had articles about how $120 barrel oil is actually desirable that I wrote in 2008. Why I want oil to hit $120 a barrel. But back to the main article, The End of Petrotyranny, I also wrote a lot of rebuttals to the people screaming about peak oil at the time. There were entire blogs devoted to the concept of peak oil, and they each kept trying to outdo each other about how crazy they could get about saying we are going to regress back to 19th century levels of prosperity and automobiles will no longer be possible because oil will be too expensive. And there's no recognition of how demand destruction could occur or how people could adapt or how there would be alternatives. Just no understanding of technology whatsoever. There was a famous blog called The Oil Drum at that time, and that blog eventually shut down, as it should have, because the entire premise of that blog was around peak oil and therefore wrong. And therefore I wrote this other article you see here, a rebuttal to peak oil doomsday predictions, and I make fun of those people, and I, of course, turned out to be right, but that was not that profound of a prediction. What was profound, however, if I do say so myself, was calculating the exact amount of excess oil price leads to what portion of technological disruption and creating an equation around that. And that equation turned out to be pretty accurate, particularly the time at which I made that equation and posted this article. So as you can read this article, which is of course in the description box below, you scroll down, I make fun of some people who keep complaining about peak oil. And then the second section, I talk about economic adaptations. What occurs when any commodity is too expensive is that alternatives start to emerge because the incentive that innovators have to create an alternative rises higher and higher the more expensive the incumbent commodity was. Now let's say you have an alternative technology that is viable when oil is above $70 a barrel. When oil goes from 70 to 80, you have $10 of market delta to work with. When it goes from 80 to 90, you have $20 because 90 is $20 above 70. When it goes to 100, you have $30 to work with. So just going from 80 to 100, while that may seem like it's only a 25% rise in oil, that is a tripling in the market delta that an innovator has to work with. And therefore, the more oil rises, the pressure to replace it is exponential, not linear. And that is, in fact, one of the main foundations of the atom thesis, which I hope all of you have read. When anything is too expensive, technology always finds a way to either topple it outright or adapt around it. Remember that. When anything gets too expensive, and not just commodities, processes, whatever, but commodities are the most obvious example. When anything gets too expensive, technology always finds a way either around it or a way to topple it. Which leads me to the equation that I have, which in turn has led to the text you see in the blue over here, where I state oil consumption worldwide will never exceed $4 trillion per year, no matter how much inflation, political turmoil, or economic growth there is. Thus, peak oil consumption happens long before peak oil supply ever could. Now, this is something that nobody believed at the time because they thought oil could reach some ridiculous number like $180, $200, $220 a barrel. But I said, no, human ingenuity is better than that, and the accelerating technonomic medium, the ability of technology to adapt to these types of supply shocks, is much more in the 21st century than it was the last time we had oil shocks, which were 1974 and 1981. The technological medium of the world was not advanced enough at that time to create substitution, but in the 2000s it certainly was, and this was the fundamental conceptual gap between people who understand technology versus those who are still crowing about peak oil. So without making this video too long, I go down to the actual equation. So in blue, as you can see in the article, I said, now remember this was written on July 1st, 2011, so I said, from the start of 2011, measure the dollar years of area enclosed by a chart of the price of oil above $70. There are only 200 such dollar years remaining for the current world petro order. We call this the law of finite petrotyranny. And I describe how this equation works. Like, let's say oil is $100 a barrel for a full year. That is $30 above the $70 mark, so that is $30 years worth of points. And there's only 200 such points that oil could deplete. In fact, oil ended up not using all 200 of those points because it fell in late 2014. Oil fell from what seemed to be a permanent state of $100+ a barrel down to just $50 a barrel. And now, 7 years later, oil still cannot go above $70 a barrel. And this is after trillions upon trillions of dollars of money printing through quantitative easing. Almost $30 trillion of money has been printed, and oil is still $67, $68 a barrel. Now remember, in 2011, it was not really possible to predict exactly which technology would completely win out. It turned out to be hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, but other candidates such as cellulose, ethanol, and electric vehicles were also in contention, and electric vehicles are succeeding, but fracking lowered the price of oil to such an extent that the electric vehicle revolution was delayed by a few years. But the fact that electric vehicles are selling even now at this lower oil price shows how impossible it is for oil to actually get above $70 a barrel for any sustained period of time, let alone go to $100 or $150 or $200 a barrel. So if you want to understand the mechanics behind this equation and how I predicted it and the parameters of scenarios around this equation, you should read this article. It's perhaps too complicated to go through in this video, but the same can apply to a commodity like gold. Technology can now increase the supply of gold faster than speculators can push up the price of gold. So gold has not been rising in tandem with the $30 trillion of money printing, for example, and I've spoken about that in other videos. Now, of course, that video clip was from a couple of years ago. Since that time, because the Biden administration has greatly obstructed U.S. domestic oil fracking, and more importantly, this Russia-Ukraine war has caused oil prices to rise, we got a bit more of a blip, all the way up to $120 a barrel briefly. But look how quickly it came back down. What few X points were still remaining unused have gone down. Are they fully depleted or not? We'll see. I won't claim that it's never going to go above $70 a barrel again once it goes below, but this used up a large portion of those remaining X points, and the key was how quickly it fell. It's like throwing a ball up into the air. You can only throw it so high before it falls, and a very strong person can only throw a ball to reach a height slightly higher than what the average person can get the ball to reach. Just like gravity will bring the ball down because no one can ever throw a ball at escape velocity, the same is true for oil prices. The mechanisms to adapt around high oil prices through both substitution as well as increase in supply are just now very, very advanced. This is how the economy of today differs from even 2007, let alone the 1973 to 1981 period. And again, now we're lingering at $70 a barrel, which is a much lower price relative to world GDP, as well as to the price of the S&P 500 relative to here. So my entire law of finite petrotyranny and my X points equation is manifested in this chart. I hope you found this enlightening because it tells us a great deal about how to make these predictions and how these very, very profound predictions are not that hard to make once you understand the first principles. I have to say that people have won the Nobel Prize in economics for discoveries far less profound than this, but I can only keep doing what I'm doing and see where the chips fall. And to watch a read-through of that Law of Finite Petrotyranny article, you can click on this video up here in the tag in the upper right-hand corner. Thanks for watching.